A homeless boy helps a millionaire find his briefcase and is rewarded with dinner. However, when he looks at the man's neck, the boy is shocked and exclaims, "New York hummed with a familiar rhythm that night, its streets an endless cascade of motion and noise." Neon signs blinked above impatient taxis, their horns punctuating the din. The sidewalks swarmed with a tide of bodies, all moving with a purpose Christian couldn't summon. His steps felt heavy, deliberate, as though the pavement dragged at his soles. He adjusted the lapels of his coat, his thoughts drifting to the same unresolved ache that had haunted him for years. Nancy. The name lingered like a whisper against his chest, locked behind the pendant he wore beneath his shirt. 4 years had passed since she disappeared, and in that void he had learned how to bury questions he'd never have answered. But even buried things had roots, and tonight they twisted tighter than usual. Christian barely registered the man approaching from the side until he felt the sharp tug on his arm. A flurry of movement followed, a briefcase yanked from his grip, the snap of its leather handle echoing in his ears. He turned, startled, as the thief bolted into the crowd. "Hey, stop!" Christian's voice cracked against the air, but no one slowed. Faces turned briefly, eyes flickering with curiosity or apathy, before returning to their destinations. Christian stumbled forward, his hands clenched and useless, until a blur of movement shot past him. A boy. Small, wiry and fast, weaving between startled pedestrians with practiced ease. His sneakers barely skimmed the ground, and Christian caught only a flash of his frayed hoodie before the boy vanished after the thief. Christian froze, unsure of whether to follow or stay, and the city engulfed him completely for a seemingly endless moment. Minutes later, the boy emerged from the throng, panting heavily, one hand gripping the stolen briefcase, his other hand braced against his knee as he bent over, gasping for air. "Got it!" the boy wheezed, straightening and holding the briefcase out toward Christian. His dark eyes gleamed beneath a messy fringe of hair, and his cheeks were flushed from exertion. He couldn't have been more than 14. Christian stared at him, stunned. You got it?" "Obviously," the boy replied, his voice sharper than expected. "What? You thought I'd just take off with it?" Christian blinked, unsure whether to laugh or scold the boy's audacity. "No, but you didn't have to do that. You could have been hurt." The boy shrugged, shoving the briefcase into Christian's hands. "Yeah, well, someone had to. You weren't exactly moving fast." A laugh slipped from Christian, unbidden. It was dry, almost brittle, but real. He studied the boy more closely now, the frayed cuffs of his hoodie, his sneakers worn to their soles, the defiant set of his jaw. "What's your name?" Christian asked. "Simon," the boy muttered, glancing around as if already deciding how to escape the conversation. "Simon," Christian repeated. "Thank you. Really. That was crazy? Stupid?" Simon interrupted, smirking faintly. "I've heard it before." "Brave," Christian finished. "It was brave." Simon's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something else. Uncertainty, maybe, or disbelief. He crossed his arms. "Well, whatever. You're welcome, I guess." Christian hesitated, feeling the weight of the briefcase in his hand. Inside were contracts and documents he couldn't lose, but none of it mattered as much as this strange, scrappy kid standing before him. "Can I buy you dinner?" he offered. "It's the least I can do." Simon frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" "Why not?" Simon's gaze darted to the street, calculating. For a moment, Christian thought he'd bolt, but then the boy shrugged again, feigning indifference. "Fine, but nothing fancy." Christian smiled faintly, gesturing toward a small diner across the street. "Does that work?" Simon nodded, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets as they crossed the street together. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a warm yellow glow over the worn vinyl booths. It smelled like coffee, grease, and something faintly sweet. As they slid into a booth, Christian watched Simon carefully. The boy's eyes darted toward the menu before settling on the table, tracing the faint scratches on its surface. He didn't speak, his guarded demeanor making him seem older than he was. "Order whatever you want," Christian said, breaking the silence. Simon glanced up, his expression skeptical. "You sure?" Christian nodded. "I owe you." Simon studied him for a moment before picking up the menu. "All right, but don't think this makes us friends or anything." Christian chuckled softly. "Noted." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware from the other tables. Christian let the space stretch, resisting the urge to fill it. Simon was like a tightly coiled spring, and pushing too hard might make him snap. When their food arrived, Simon tackled his plate with an efficiency that left a lasting impression. Christian didn't comment, but he couldn't ignore the pang of something. Sympathy? Regret? Curling in his chest. "So," Christian said finally, keeping his tone light, "how'd you learn to run like that?" Simon smirked through a mouthful of fries. "Living out here, you learn quick." Christian's smile faded slightly, but he nodded. "I bet." And just like that, the silence returned, heavier this time. But Christian didn't mind. For the first time in years, it felt like something was beginning, even if he didn't know what. The clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversations filled the diner, wrapping Simon and Christian in an oddly intimate cocoon. Simon hunched over his plate, a mountain of fries rapidly vanishing under his determined focus. Christian sat across from him, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze flickering between Simon and the view outside the fogged window. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was loaded, like a question neither of them wanted to ask. "Do you eat like this every day?" Christian finally ventured, his voice calm but probing. Simon glanced up, a fry half lifted to his mouth. His lips twitched in what might have been a smirk, but his eyes held no humor. "What you mean, scarfing down food like I've got 10 seconds to live?" "Yeah, pretty much." Christian leaned back in his seat, considering the boy. There was something sharp about Simon, not in his tone, but in his manner, like someone who'd learned to stay braced for impact. "How long have you been out here?" Simon shrugged, stabbing at the ketchup pooled on his plate. "Long enough." Christian let the answer hang between them, waiting to see if Simon would fill the gap. He didn't. "All right," Christian said, setting down his mug. "So, what's the story? Why'd you bother chasing down some random guy's briefcase?" Simon chewed thoughtfully, as though weighing whether to respond. When he did, his tone was clipped. "Didn't do it for you. Did it because the guy looked like a jerk?" Christian couldn't help but laugh, short and genuine. "Fair enough." He was, but that doesn't answer my question. Simon's fork hovered mid-air, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe I'm just good at reading people. You didn't look like you could afford to lose that thing." Christian tilted his head. "And how would you know that?" Simon met his gaze evenly, the smirk resurfacing. "You looked desperate. Like losing that bag would have cost you more than just what's in it." The words landed with surprising weight. Christian felt a faint, familiar sting in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Good read." Simon shrugged again, brushing off the compliment like dust. He pushed his plate aside, leaning back in the booth. "Anyway, no big deal. Not like I had anything better to do." Christian didn't press further. There was a hardness to Simon's deflections that felt earned, too deliberate to be challenged outright. Instead, His attention drifted to the boy's clothes, the faded hoodie with frayed cuffs, the sneakers that barely held together. Simon noticed and bristled. "What?" he snapped, his tone defensive. "Nothing," Christian replied quickly, raising his hands. "Just... thanks. Really." Simon huffed but didn't respond. He reached for his glass of water, knocking it slightly as he did. The movement tugged Christian's gaze downward, where Simon's eyes had landed on the edge of Christian's shirt. The pendant had slipped free, catching the light. "What's that?" Simon asked, his tone suddenly sharper. Christian glanced down, startled. He followed Simon's gaze and realized the pendant had opened just slightly. "Oh, just something personal," he said, tucking it back into his shirt. But Simon's curiosity had already sparked. "Can I see?" Simon asked, leaning forward. Christian hesitated. For a moment, he considered refusing, but the boy's intensity was hard to ignore. With a sigh, he pulled the pendant free, letting it rest in his palm. He opened it carefully, revealing the small, worn photo inside. The change in Simon's expression was instant. His smirk vanished, replaced by a stunned stillness that froze his features. His hand hovered over the table, as if reaching for something invisible. "Where did you get that?" Simon's voice cracked, low but urgent. Christian frowned. "It's a picture of Nancy. She was someone important to me." Simon's hand dropped to the table, his fingers curling into a fist. "Nancy," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the photo. His voice grew louder, tinged with something raw. "That's my sister." Christian blinked, the words settling between them like a sudden gust. "Your sister?" he repeated, his own voice faltering. Simon nodded, his breathing uneven. "She disappeared 4 years ago. Just vanished. I've been on my own ever since." The edges of Simon's composure began to fray, the resilience he wore like armor cracking under the weight of the revelation. Christian felt his throat tighten. "She was my..." Christian paused, struggling to find the words. "We were together. And then one day, she was gone. No warning, no explanation. I thought..." He stopped himself, the memory too bitter to finish aloud. Simon's gaze snapped to Christian, his eyes brimming with a mix of anger and desperation. "If you knew her, why didn't you find her? Why didn't you..." He broke off, swallowing hard. Christian exhaled slowly, the ache of old wounds stirring again. "I tried," he said quietly. "For years. But it was like she disappeared off the face of the earth." Simon leaned back, the tension in his shoulders not easing. He looked at Christian for a long moment, then down at the pendant again. "She's out there," he said, more to himself than Christian. "She has to be." Christian nodded, his hand curling protectively around the pendant. "Then we'll find her. Together." Simon didn't reply, but the flicker of something fragile, hope, passed across his face. For now, it was enough. The night air had turned crisp by the time they left the diner. Simon stuffed his hands into his hoodie pockets, his steps cautious as he trailed a half-step behind Christian. The city's bustle had subsided, as though Nancy's revelation had obscured their surroundings. Christian, too, seemed lost in thought, glancing occasionally at Simon with a mixture of concern and resolve. They stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Christian cleared his throat. "Listen," he began, keeping his tone measured. "I have a place not far from here. A guest room you can use. It's better than wherever you've been staying." Simon's shoulders stiffened. He kept his gaze on the crosswalk ahead. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice flat. "Sleeping on benches is fine?" Christian countered, his voice soft but pointed. Because that's what it looks like. Simon's jaw tightened, his silence a wall Christian didn't push against. The light turned green, and they crossed together, the quiet stretching longer this time. When they reached the edge of Christian's building, he paused, looking back at Simon. "It's just a place to crash," he said. "No strings, you can leave whenever you want." Simon hesitated, his eyes darting to the entrance. The polished glass doors seemed out of place in his world, a barrier he wasn't sure he could cross. Finally, with a resigned huff, he nodded. "All right, one night." Christian didn't argue. He opened the door and held it for Simon, who slipped inside with a wary glance. Christian's apartment was spacious, but not ostentatious, a place that spoke of quiet success rather than flaunted wealth. Simon lingered by the doorway, his eyes darting to the sleek furniture, the bookshelves lined with worn volumes, and the faint hum of a heater kicking on. "You don't have to stand there," Christian said, setting his keys on the kitchen counter. "Establish yourself comfortably." Simon didn't move. "This isn't my home." Christian didn't reply immediately, sensing the tension in Simon's voice. He turned to the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water, and set it on the counter. "Guest room's down the hall," he said instead. "First door on the right. There's a bathroom connected. Towels are in the cabinet." Simon lingered for another moment before shuffling down the hall. Christian watched him go, noting the stiffness in his gait, the way his shoulders never quite relaxed. The following morning, Simon emerged from the guest room looking disheveled, but slightly less guarded. Christian was at the dining table, laptop open, and a mug of coffee in hand. He glanced up as Simon entered. "Morning," Christian greeted lightly. Simon grunted in response, hovering by the edge of the room. "Do you, need me to leave?" Christian closed his laptop, leaning back in his chair. "No, you're fine. Hungry?" Simon hesitated before nodding. Christian gestured toward the kitchen. "Help yourself. There's cereal, bread for toast, and eggs if you know how to cook." Simon shuffled over, his movements cautious but growing in confidence. He settled on toast, eyeing the toaster as if it might betray him. Christian hid a small smile behind his coffee cup. As Simon ate, Christian spoke again. "You ever think about school?" Simon glanced up, his brows furrowing. "What for?" "To learn. To get somewhere." Simon snorted. "Yeah, sure. Like school ever did anyone a favor." Christian set his mug down. "It's not perfect, but it's a start. Something to build on." Simon didn't answer, but his chewing slowed, his expression thoughtful. The days stretched into a rhythm. Christian didn't push Simon about staying, and Simon didn't leave. Small moments, such as Christian teaching Simon how to use the espresso machine, and Simon teaching Christian how to recognize the signs of a scam on the street, helped to bridge their differences. Their conversations were cautious, punctuated by long silences, but the edges began to soften. One evening, Christian sat at his desk, scrolling through old emails and news archives. Nancy's face stared back at him from a photo, a candid shot he had taken years ago, her laugh frozen in time. He clicked through the files, his jaw tightening. 4 years. 4 years of questions with no answers. Simon wandered in, peering over Christian's shoulder. "You really think you'll find something?" he asked, his tone skeptical, but not unkind. Christian nodded. "I have to try." Simon studied him for a moment before crossing his arms. "She's out there. I know it." Christian looked up, meeting Simon's gaze. For once, the boy's confidence didn't feel like bravado. It was something deeper, something Christian had almost forgotten how to feel. Belief. "I hope you're right," Christian said softly. Simon smirked faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching. "You'll see. I'm always right. Christian chuckled, shaking his head. All right, smart guy. Let's prove it. It'd been a long time. Christian felt the faint flicker of hope returning, not just for Nancy, but for the future they might still have. The soft hum of a desk lamp cast a warm glow over Christian's living room. Simon sat cross-legged on the floor, a textbook open in front of him, scowling at a page covered in equations. Nearby, Christian perched on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with a pencil in hand. "You're overthinking it," Christian said, his tone calm but insistent. "Focus on the steps, not the whole problem. Consider each step individually." Simon shot him a look, the kind of glare that only a teenager can perfect. "Easy for you to say. Bet you didn't have to deal with this junk when you were my age." Christian chuckled softly, tapping the pencil against the paper. "Actually, I did, and I was terrible at it." Simon blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Christian confirmed, "but I had a teacher who wouldn't let me give up. And now—" He gestured around the room, highlighting the subtle elegance of his apartment. Simon tilted his head, his eyes scanning the room, as if seeing it for the first time. "Yeah, well, looks like it paid off. This place is, nice. Like, really nice." Christian shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's just a place. What matters is what you build, not what you have." Simon stared at him for a moment, then back at the textbook. "All right, fine," he muttered, gripping the pencil. "Let's try this again." Later that evening, Christian stood by the window, a glass of water in hand. The city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like a sea of fireflies. Somewhere out there, Nancy's presence lingered, elusive and constant, like a half-remembered melody. The smell of fresh rain against asphalt brought him back to another night, years ago. He could almost hear her laughter echoing down the narrow streets of Brooklyn, her voice teasing as they argued over the best spot for late-night coffee. "You always pick the places that close early," she had said, nudging him playfully. "You're no fun. And you always find the ones where the coffee tastes like motor oil," Christian had countered, his grin widening as she swatted his arm. The memory faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head as if to dislodge the lingering ghost of her smile. In the kitchen, Simon rummaged through the fridge, his movements careful, but growing more assured. He pulled out a leftover sandwich, unwrapping it with the precision of someone used to making things last. Christian watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You've been here a month now," Christian said, his voice steady. "Getting used to it?" Simon shrugged, taking a bite. "Yeah, I guess. Better than out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window. Christian nodded. "You've got potential, Simon. More than you realize." Simon swallowed, looking up at him with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Christian began, leaning against the counter, "that you've got a sharp mind and a good heart. You could do something with that." Simon snorted, but the edges of his smirk softened. "You sound like a motivational poster." Christian smiled, letting the comment roll off. "Just think about it." Their growing bond was subtle, marked by small exchanges. Christian noticed Simon's posture relax slightly over meals, the way his guarded replies grew a little longer. Simon, in turn, began asking questions, not about Christian's wealth, but about his decisions, his past. One evening, as they sat across from each other with plates of pasta, Simon leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "So, why'd you let me stay? You don't even know me." Christian set his fork down, meeting Simon's gaze. "Because someone gave me a chance once. Thought I'd pay it forward." Simon's brow furrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded, as if filing the answer away for later consideration. It was Simon's stories that planted the seed. Simon's tales of scurrying for shelter on stormy nights and sharing half-stale sandwiches with other kids on the street painted a picture that Christian couldn't ignore. The idea began to take shape slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. One evening, Christian sat at his desk, a notepad in front of him. "Simon," he called over his shoulder, "what would you think about starting something bigger?" Simon poked his head around the corner. "Like what?" "A charity," Christian said, turning to face him. "Something to help kids like you, people who've been through what you've been through." Simon frowned, his arms crossing defensively. "You think I'm a charity case?" Christian shook his head. "No, but you've got insight, things I couldn't understand without you. We could do some real good together." Simon studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'm in." The idea for Vermont came from a report Christian read late one night, detailing underserved rural communities. He showed it to Simon the next morning, the boy's brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. "Looks rough," Simon said, his voice quieter than usual. "It is," Christian agreed, "but we can make a difference there." Simon glanced up, a flicker of something warm in his eyes. "Yeah, let's do it." And so, the plan was set. Vermont would be their first step, a way to bring their shared vision to life, one small act of kindness at a time. Christian's dining table had become a makeshift war room. A laptop hummed softly at its center, surrounded by a scatter of papers, notes scribbled in the margins, reports flagged with sticky tabs, and a rough sketch of what Christian optimistically called a roadmap. Simon sat across from him, squinting at a spreadsheet on the screen, his arms folded tight across his chest. "This is a lot," Simon muttered, his voice edged with skepticism. "Like, a lot. You sure we can pull this off?" Christian leaned back in his chair, watching Simon carefully. "I wouldn't have started this if I didn't think we could," he replied, his tone even. "And besides, you're helping. That makes it easier." Simon snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. Like I know anything about logistics." He gestured vaguely at the screen, his posture tense. "I mean, what do I know about running a charity?" Christian smiled faintly, recognizing the defensiveness for what it was. "You know what it's like out there," he said simply. "That's more important than you think." Simon didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the papers in front of him, his fingers tracing the edge of a printed map of Vermont. "Guess I do," he admitted, so softly Christian almost missed it. Over the next week, the apartment buzzed with quiet activity. Christian had a way of delegating tasks to Simon that made the boy feel more like a partner than a student. When Simon balked at the spreadsheets, Christian handed him a notebook and asked him to brainstorm ideas for outreach. When Simon hesitated over the phone to confirm a shipment of donated supplies, Christian simply sat beside him, quietly coaching without overtaking. Small victories marked their progress. The first time Simon successfully coordinated with a local food bank, he grinned so wide, Christian thought his face might split. "Told you I could do it," Simon said, his tone light, but his pride unmistakable. Christian clapped him on the shoulder. "Never doubted you for a second." Still, doubts lingered in quieter moments. One evening, Simon stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than usual, hunched and unsure. "You okay?" Christian asked, leaning against the doorway. Simon didn't turn around. "You ever feel like you're just not enough for something? Like, no matter what you do, it's never going to be enough?" Christian hesitated, his instinct to respond clashing with the need to let Simon lead the moment. Finally, he walked over and stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "All the time," he said, "especially when I started building my business. Every mistake felt huge, like it proved I didn't belong." Simon glanced at him, skepticism warring with curiosity. "How'd you get past it?" Christian smiled faintly. "I didn't. I just kept going. Turns out that's usually enough." Simon didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Amid the planning, Christian stumbled upon an unexpected relic of the past. He was rummaging through an old storage box, searching for a binder he thought might be useful, when his fingers brushed against something smooth and familiar. He pulled it out. A small, leather-bound journal. Nancy's journal. For a moment, he just stared at it, his thumb brushing over the scuffed corners. He remembered the way she'd carried it everywhere, her pen often tucked behind her ear as she scribbled down sudden thoughts or ideas. Flipping it open, he found pages filled with her looping handwriting, snippets of dialogue, fragments of poetry, and sketches of places they'd visited together. One line caught his eye. "The hardest part of running isn't the distance. It's not knowing if someone will follow." Christian exhaled slowly, the ache in his chest sharp and familiar. He closed the journal carefully and placed it on his desk beside the laptop. He didn't tell Simon about it. Not yet. The Vermont plan began to take shape, its details solidifying with each passing day. Simon proved an invaluable resource, his sharp insights cutting through some of the logistical noise that Christian might have missed. "You can't just show up and hand out stuff," Simon pointed out one afternoon, his tone unusually firm. "People need to feel like you're listening to them, not just throwing charity at their faces." Christian nodded, making a note. "Good point. We'll make sure we have time to talk to the community leaders first." Simon smirked, leaning back in his chair. "See? You need me." "I never said otherwise," Christian replied, grinning. As their plans coalesced, the date for the trip to Vermont loomed closer. Simon's excitement was palpable, though it often showed in subtle ways, a bounce in his step, an eagerness to dive into tasks he'd previously avoided. Christian watched him quietly, feeling a strange mix of pride and hope. Still, late at night, Christian often found himself staring at Nancy's journal, the weight of it grounding him. He didn't know if Vermont would bring them closer to finding her, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that, he thought, was worth everything. Other people listening to this story, in a state of wanting to reconnect with a loved one, but haven't found a way. Leave what you want to say to them in the comments section. Maybe they will see and understand. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, the kind of crisp air that carried the promise of change. Simon stood by the car, his arms crossed, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He squinted at the sedan Christian had rented, a skeptical smile tugging at his lips. "Not exactly a road trip car," Simon quipped. "Where's the convertible?" Christian chuckled as he loaded their bags into the trunk. "We're going to Vermont, not cruising the Pacific Coast Highway. You'll be grateful for the legroom after a few hours." Simon shrugged, slipping into the passenger seat. The interior smelled faintly of new upholstery, a sharp contrast to the well-worn streets they were leaving behind. Christian slid behind the wheel, adjusting the GPS before glancing at Simon. "Ready?" Simon nodded, his expression unreadable, but Christian caught the faintest flicker of anticipation in his eyes. The drive unfolded with an easy rhythm, the miles marked by rolling landscapes and the occasional burst of banter. Christian kept the conversation light, asking Simon about music, favorite foods, and places he wanted to visit someday. Simon responded cautiously at first, but as the hours passed, his answers grew longer, more animated. "You ever been to the mountains?" Christian asked as they passed a sign for the Green Mountain National Forest. Simon shook his head. Closest I've been is looking at pictures. They seem big. They are, Christian said, his gaze briefly lingering on the tree-lined horizon. You'll like it. It's quieter than the city. Different pace. Simon leaned his head against the window, watching the scenery blur past. Quieter doesn't sound bad. By the time they reached the small town nestled in the heart of Vermont, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets. The place was charming in its simplicity. Clapboard houses painted in muted pastels, a single main street with a few shops, and a weathered community center that seemed to serve as the town's hub. Christian parked near the center, stepping out and stretching his legs. Simon followed, his gaze darting around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Feels empty, Simon murmured. Christian nodded. A lot of these rural areas are like that. Small populations, not much funding. That's why we're here. Inside the community center, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and old books. They were greeted by an older woman named Marge, her handshake firm and her smile warm but weary. You must be Christian and Simon, she said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone of someone who had spent years running a tight ship. Welcome to our little corner of the world. Thank you for having us, Christian said. He introduced Simon, who gave a brief nod, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. Marge led them on a tour of the center, pointing out the worn desks, peeling paint, and shelves of donated books. We do the best we can, she said, her voice tinged with pride and resignation. But resources are scarce, and volunteers even scarcer. Simon lingered near a stack of faded children's books, his fingers brushing the cracked spines. Christian watched him quietly, noting the way his posture softened, his usual guardedness slipping away. Later, as they sat around a small table discussing logistics with Marge and a few other community members, Christian caught a snippet of conversation from a nearby group. Amber said she might swing by later, a younger woman remarked, flipping through a binder. You know how she loves writing about events like this. Christian's attention flicked to the name. Amber. The woman glanced up. Oh, she's a writer. Freelances for a lot of local papers. Always looking for a good story. She's been here a while now. Sweet girl. Kind of quiet. Interesting, Christian said casually, filing the information away. It was a common enough name, but something about it lingered in his mind. Simon, oblivious to the exchange, was engrossed in a conversation about supply distribution, his enthusiasm growing with each suggestion he offered. Christian let the moment pass, deciding not to press further. The first day ended with the two of them checking into a modest bed and breakfast on the edge of town. The room was small but clean, with handmade quilts draped over the beds and the faint scent of lavender in the air. Simon flopped onto one of the beds, his legs dangling over the edge. This is not what I expected, Simon admitted after a pause. Christian raised an eyebrow as he unpacked his bag. Good or bad? Simon smirked. Different. Not bad. Christian smiled, tossing Simon a water bottle. Get some rest. Big day tomorrow. As Christian settled into his bed, his mind returned briefly to the mention of Amber. It wasn't enough to warrant more than a fleeting curiosity. But still, he wondered. Closing his eyes, he let the thought drift away, focusing instead on the quiet satisfaction of seeing Simon find his footing in a new environment. Outside, the Vermont night wrapped around the town, its stillness punctuated only by the distant chirp of crickets. The journey had begun, and though neither of them knew what lay ahead, it already felt like a step towards something meaningful. The community center bustled with activity the next morning. Volunteers moved between tables, sorting donated goods, stacking supplies, and preparing for the day's event. The faint aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sharper scent of disinfectant, and Simon stood near the main entrance, clipboard in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Christian watched him from across the room, suppressing a smile. Simon's transformation over the past few weeks was subtle but unmistakable. His movements more confident, his tone sharper yet measured when delegating tasks. Christian felt a quiet pride in the boy's growing sense of ownership. "All right, we've got the hygiene kits over here," Simon was saying to a volunteer, gesturing toward a table piled with small packages. "Just make sure each family gets one. No doubling up." Christian approached, patting Simon's shoulder lightly. "You're a natural at this." Simon shrugged, but didn't hide the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, well, someone's got to keep things running." The first few hours passed in a blur of handshakes, smiles, and quiet exchanges as community members trickled in. Christian spent most of his time speaking with local leaders, absorbing their stories, and listening to their concerns. Simon, meanwhile, stayed at the front lines, helping distribute supplies and chatting with the younger kids who came through. It was just after midday when she appeared. Christian didn't notice her at first. His attention focused on a group of teachers discussing after-school programs. But Simon froze mid-conversation, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just walked in. She moved with a quiet confidence, her notebook tucked under one arm and a camera slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her eyes scanned the room with an almost clinical curiosity. She wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans, blending effortlessly into the understated crowd, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Simon stepped back, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "Christian," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Look." Christian turned, his gaze following Simon's. The sight of her caught his breath. For a moment, it felt like time had splintered, half of him standing in the present, the other half pulled into the past. It was Nancy, and yet it wasn't. Her features were eerily familiar, down to the slight tilt of her head as she spoke to Marge, who greeted her warmly. But there were subtle differences, her posture straighter, her expression more guarded, and a faint scar along her jawline that Christian didn't remember. Christian took a slow step forward, his mind racing. No, it couldn't be. Nancy had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions. This woman, Amber, if the locals were to be believed, was a stranger. But Simon didn't see a stranger. His voice cracked as he called out, "Nancy!" The room seemed to shrink around them as the word hung in the air. The woman turned, her brows knitting together in confusion as she looked at Simon, then at Christian, who had joined him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Do I know you?" Christian hesitated, searching her face for any glimmer of recognition. "You look familiar," he said carefully, his tone devoid of accusation, but laden with curiosity. "What's your name?" "Amber," she replied, gripping her notebook a little tighter. "Amber Quinn." Simon stepped forward, his movements jerky, as if pulled by some invisible force. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're Nancy. You're my sister." Amber's confusion deepened, her gaze flickering between Simon and Christian. "I think you have me mistaken for someone else," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "No," Simon insisted, his voice rising. "It's you. It has to be. Don't you remember me?" Amber stepped back, her hands raising instinctively as if to ward off the intensity of Simon's emotions. "I don't know who you are," she said, her tone cracking under the weight of his desperation. Christian placed a steady hand on Simon's shoulder, his own heart pounding in his chest. "Simon," he said gently, though his own mind raced with questions. Let's not overwhelm her. Amber's breathing quickened, her face paling as the tension in the room thickened. I think I need to go, she stammered, turning toward the exit. But her steps faltered, and she swayed. Amber? Christian moved instinctively, catching her just as her knees buckled. She slumped against him, unconscious. Someone call for help, he shouted, lowering her carefully to the ground. Simon knelt beside them, his face pale and stricken. Marge hurried over, her phone already pressed to her ear, barking instructions to the 911 operator. The room buzzed with urgent whispers as Christian cradled Amber, his mind a blur of questions. Who was this woman? Could she truly be Nancy? Or was this just a cruel trick of fate? The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Amber was whisked away to the small-town hospital. As Christian and Simon followed, the weight of uncertainty settled over them both, heavy and unyielding. Whatever answers lay ahead, they knew their journey had just taken a turn neither of them could have anticipated. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the muted hum of activity from the hallway. Amber lay still on the narrow bed, her dark hair splayed against the stark white pillow. A faint bandage covered her temple, a reminder of her sudden collapse. Simon sat in a stiff plastic chair by her side, his hands clenched together, his gaze fixed on her face, as if willing her to wake up. Christian stood near the window, his arms crossed, staring out at the small town framed by distant hills. His thoughts churned, questions overlapping, theories forming and crumbling in equal measure. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked to the journal tucked in his coat pocket, Nancy's handwriting a quiet weight he hadn't yet shared with Simon. The door opened, and an older woman with soft grey hair and a nurse's badge stepped inside. Her face was lined with a mixture of concern and something Christian couldn't quite place. "You must be the ones who brought her in," she said, her voice kind but firm. "I'm Helena, Amber's mother." Simon's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Mother?" he repeated, his voice sharp. "She's not your daughter." Helena sighed, stepping closer to the bed. Her hand rested on the railing, her gaze lingering on Amber with a tenderness that made Simon bristle. "She is, in a way," Helena said softly. "But maybe we should talk outside." Christian nodded, motioning for Simon to follow. Simon hesitated, his jaw tight, before rising reluctantly. The three of them stepped into the hallway, where Helena led them to a quiet corner. "Let me explain," Helena began, her hands clasped tightly. 4 years ago, I was driving home late one night when I saw her, Amber, on the side of the road. She was unconscious, badly injured, head trauma, broken ribs. Someone had hit her with a car and left her there. Simon's breath hitched, and Christian placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Helena continued, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. She had no ID, no wallet, nothing to tell me who she was. When she woke up in the hospital, she didn't remember anything. Not her name, not where she came from. She didn't even know her own face. Simon's fists clenched at his sides. "You didn't think to look for her family, for someone who might have been looking for her?" Helena met his gaze evenly. "Of course I did. We contacted the police, filed reports, and searched missing persons databases. Nothing came up. It was like she didn't exist." Christian frowned, his mind racing. "So you gave her a new identity?" Helena nodded. "She was so lost, so frightened. I couldn't leave her alone like that. I called her Amber. It was my late daughter's name, and took her in. Over time, she started to rebuild her life. But the memories never came back." Simon's voice trembled with anger. "You just let her stay like that? Like she didn't have a past?" Helena's eyes softened. I didn't take her past from her son. I gave her a future. Back in the hospital room, Amber stirred, her brow furrowing as she opened her eyes. Simon was at her side instantly, his voice tight with emotion. Nancy, Amber, whatever your name is. Do you know me? Amber blinked at him, confusion clouding her gaze. I don't... Christian stepped closer, his voice gentler. It's all right. Take your time. Amber's eyes darted between them, her breathing quickening. You're the ones from earlier, she said, her tone uncertain. You called me Nancy. Simon nodded, his voice thick. Because that's who you are. You're my sister. Amber pressed a hand to her temple, her expression pained. I don't remember, she whispered. I don't know anything about being Nancy. I'm Amber. That's all I've ever known. Helena moved to her bedside, her hand resting lightly on Amber's shoulder. It's okay, she said softly. You don't have to force anything. But Simon couldn't hide the frustration in his voice. You're not Amber. You're Nancy. How can you not see that? Christian stepped in, his tone firm but calm. Simon, she's been through a lot. We have to give her space. Amber's hand curled into the sheets, her face pale. I want to help you, I do, she said, her voice trembling. But I don't know how. Simon stepped back, his face a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Christian placed a steady hand on his shoulder, grounding him. We'll figure it out, Christian said, his gaze locked on Amber. Together. The truth was as heavy as it was fragile, hanging between them like a delicate thread. Christian and Simon were caught between relief and anger, hope and despair. As they left the hospital room to give Amber some rest, Simon muttered under his breath, How can she not remember? Christian didn't have an answer, but as they walked down the corridor, he pulled the journal from his pocket, the weight of its contents suddenly heavier. We'll find a way to help her remember, he said quietly, even if it takes time. Simon glanced at the journal, his expression softening just slightly. You think she'll come back to us? Christian met his gaze, his own uncertainty hidden beneath quiet determination. I think we have to try. The hallway stretched ahead, each step heavy with the weight of the past and the uncertain hope of the future. The room was brighter the next morning, sunlight streaming through the thin hospital curtains. Amber sat up in bed, her hands clasped tightly around a styrofoam cup of tea. The faint aroma of chamomile filled the air, but her expression remained clouded, her eyes darting to the door every so often, as though expecting an answer to walk through it. Simon sat in the chair next to her bed, fidgeting with the edge of his hoodie. Christian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a quiet determination etched into his features. Unspoken words weighed heavily between them. I spoke with the investigators I hired, Christian said, finally, breaking the silence. His voice was measured, as if trying not to overwhelm Amber. They've been looking into what happened the night you disappeared. Amber flinched at the word disappeared, her fingers tightening around the cup. Simon's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What did they find? Christian exhaled slowly. The night Nancy... He paused, correcting himself. The night Amber was found, the driver who hit her didn't just leave her there. He took her bag. Everything that could have identified her, ID, cash, everything, was gone. That's why no one could trace her. Amber's lips parted, her breath hitching. Why would someone take my things? Christian shook his head, the bitterness in his tone subdued. Probably panic, maybe greed. Either way, it erased any connection to who you were. Simon's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of the chair. So she's been lost all this time because of some coward? Christian nodded solemnly. It gets worse. He hesitated, glancing at Amber. You were a screenwriter, Nancy. A good one. You traveled a lot, going to places others might overlook, finding inspiration in the stories no one else noticed. That's why you were in that area. It was part of your work. Amber's brow furrowed, her fingers twitching against the cup. I don't remember any of that, she murmured. I don't remember being Nancy. Simon leaned forward, his voice raw. You don't remember because someone stole your life. But it's still your life, Nancy. You can't just let it go. Amber's gaze flickered to Simon, then to Christian, and finally down to the tea in her hands. How do I know you're not just hoping I'm someone I'm not? What if I'm really just Amber? Simon's frustration boiled over, his voice rising. You're not just Amber, you're my sister. We used to climb the tree in the backyard until Mum yelled at us to come down. You taught me how to make paper planes. You made up those stupid stories about the great adventures of Simon and Nancy. How can you not remember? Amber flinched at his intensity, her hand trembling as she set the cup aside. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the monitor. Then, softly, she whispered, Paper planes? Simon's anger faltered, his face crumpling as he nodded. Yeah. You'd make me sit for hours folding them until we got it just right. You said the perfect plane could fly anywhere, even to the moon. Amber's fingers brushed her temple, her eyes distant. That, sounds familiar, she admitted, her voice so faint it was almost inaudible. Christian stepped forward, his voice gentle. That's because it's you, Nancy. It's your life, your memories. They're still there, even if they're buried. Amber looked at him, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. But what if they're not? What if I don't belong to this life? Christian hesitated, glancing at Simon before speaking. There's a way to know for sure, a DNA test. It would prove who you are. Amber recoiled slightly, her shoulders stiffening. And if it proves I'm not Nancy, what happens then? Simon shook his head vehemently. You are Nancy. There's no if. Christian crouched by her bedside, his voice steady but kind. Amber. Nancy. Whoever you are, we're not here to force you into anything. We just want the truth for you as much as for us. Amber's hands trembled as she looked between them. The fear in her eyes was palpable, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of hope, fragile and tentative. Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay. Let's do it. The hospital's small lab took the samples that afternoon, Simon's and Amber's. As they left the sterile room, Amber clutched the edges of her coat tightly, her steps slow and uncertain. Simon walked beside her, his usual sharpness tempered by an uncharacteristic softness. Hey, he said quietly, glancing at her. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this. We're here. I'm here. Amber gazed at him, her eyes scouring his face as if attempting to solve a puzzle she was unaware she was carrying. Thank you, she said softly. Christian followed a few steps behind, his gaze flicking between them. The tension in his chest hadn't eased, but for the first time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Whatever the DNA test revealed, it would bring them closer to the truth, and perhaps finally to closure. As they stepped out into the crisp Vermont air, the weight of the past hung heavy, but the promise of answers loomed just ahead. For now, all they could do was wait. The results came 2 days later. Christian and Simon sat in the hospital waiting room, the air thick with anticipation. Simon's leg bounced nervously, and Christian kept his hands folded tightly in his lap, his usually calm demeanor edged with tension. Amber had chosen to stay in her room, reluctant to face whatever truth the envelope held. When the nurse finally arrived, she handed the sealed envelope to Christian with a polite smile before retreating, leaving them alone with the weight of the moment. Simon reached for it, his movements sharp with urgency, but Christian stopped him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's do this together," Christian said quietly. Simon nodded, swallowing hard as Christian carefully opened the envelope. The words stared back at them in stark, clinical clarity, a 99.9% match. Amber was Nancy. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the truth settling over them like a heavy blanket. Simon's breath hitched, and he leaned back in his chair, his hands covering his face. Christian exhaled slowly, his grip on the paper tightening as he processed the confirmation of what he had dared to hope. Amber sat up when they entered her room, her expression guarded, but curious. "So?" she asked, her voice tentative. Simon stepped forward, his voice trembling. "It's you. The test says it's you, Nancy." Amber's hands clenched the edge of her blanket, her face a mixture of relief and fear. "I don't know how to feel about that," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Christian knelt beside her bed, placing the results gently on the bedside table. "You don't have to feel anything right now," he said. "This is just the beginning. We will approach it gradually." Amber's gaze flicked to Simon, who nodded fervently. "We'll help you remember," he added, "together." Therapy sessions began to bridge the gap between Amber and Nancy in the weeks that followed. A therapist specializing in memory recovery guided her through exercises and gently unearthed fragments of her past. The progress was slow, flashes of a childhood home, the feel of paper beneath her fingers as she wrote, the sound of Simon's laughter as a boy. Each memory came with both joy and pain, a reminder of what she had lost and what she might yet reclaim. Christian and Simon became her anchors. Simon often sat with her, recounting stories of their childhood, his voice animated as he described their adventures. "You used to call me your co-pilot," he said one evening, grinning. "We were going to fly all over the world one day." Amber tilted her head, her brows furrowed. "Co-pilot," she murmured, the word tasting familiar on her tongue. "I think I called you that because you hated being the assistant." Simon's grin widened. "Exactly." Christian, on the other hand, brought pieces of her adult life into focus. He showed her photographs of her travels, recounting the stories she had shared with him. One afternoon, he handed her a worn notebook, the journal she had filled with ideas for her scripts. Amber traced her fingers over the cover, her breath catching. "This was mine." Christian nodded. "You used to carry it everywhere. You said it was like your compass." As she flipped through the pages, a tear slipped down her cheek. She whispered, the realization overwhelming her like a wave. "I remember writing on a train, the sound of the wheels, the smell of coffee." Christian's voice was soft. "That's you, Nancy. That's who you are." A quiet afternoon marked a pivotal moment when Simon pulled out an old paper plane. He had folded it carefully, mimicking the ones they used to make as kids. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "I thought this might help." Amber took it hesitantly, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the folds. Then, as if a light had flickered on in her mind, she smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile. "This is the perfect plan," she said, her voice breaking. "It has the potential to succeed anywhere." Simon's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. "Even to the moon." Amber looked at him, her own eyes glistening. "I remember that," she said. "I remember you." Simon couldn't hold back any longer. He wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in years, she hugged him back, her hold tight and certain. The reunion was not without its challenges. Amber's memories were fragmented, her emotions raw. Christian and Simon learned to navigate her moments of doubt and frustration, their patience unwavering. However, gradually, the barriers between them started to break down. One evening, as they sat together in the small cottage Helena had offered them, Amber looked at Christian and Simon with a softness that hadn't been there before. "I don't know if I'll ever remember everything," she admitted, "but I know this. You're my family, and I want to be Nancy again." Simon grinned, his voice thick with emotion. "You already are." Christian reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Welcome home, Nancy." The three of them sat in silence, the weight of the past giving way to the promise of a new beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, they faced it together, as a family. Months passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm for Christian, Nancy, and Simon. The delicate balance of healing and rediscovery wove their days together, each moment a step toward reclaiming a shared sense of purpose. Nancy, now fully embracing her identity, had returned to writing. Her desk, nestled near the sunlit corner of Christian's apartment, was scattered with papers, drafts of scripts and notes. Simon often peeked over her shoulder, his curiosity igniting a spark of creativity between them. "What's this one about?" Simon asked one afternoon, pointing at a scene sketched in her notebook. Nancy smiled, her pen tapping against the page. "It's about a boy and his sister. They get lost in the woods and have to rely on each other to find their way home." Simon smirked. "Sounds familiar." "Maybe a little," Nancy admitted, her tone warm. She turned to him, her expression softening. "You've always been my co-pilot, you know." Simon grinned, leaning against her chair. "And you've always been the one with the map." Simon, too, was thriving. Enrolled in school for the first time in years, he excelled in his classes, surprising even himself with how much he enjoyed learning. Christian often stayed up late helping him study, their bond deepening as Simon grew more confident. "You're smarter than you think," Christian said one night after Simon aced a particularly tough math quiz. Simon shrugged, trying to hide his pride. "Guess I had a decent teacher." Christian chuckled. "And a lot of determination. Don't sell yourself short." The family's gratitude to Helena couldn't be overstated. One crisp autumn weekend, they returned to Vermont to visit her, carrying baskets of flowers and homemade pastries. Helena greeted them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Nancy. "You're looking more like yourself," Helena said, hugging her tightly. "Thanks to you," Nancy replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I would have survived without you." Helena smiled, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You would have found your way, Nancy. You're stronger than you know." They spent the day together, walking through the quiet town and reminiscing. Helena recounted additional tales from her years of caring for Nancy, which helped her fill in the gaps of her absence. By evening, they gathered around Helena's small kitchen table, the room filled with laughter and the comforting scent of baked apple pie. "You've got a good family," Helena said, her eyes shining as she looked at Christian and Simon. "Take care of each other." "We will," Christian promised. The symbolic closure came on a quiet Sunday evening at Christian's home. The dining table was set with care, a blend of dishes that reflected each of their tastes: Simon's favorite lasagna, Nancy's love for fresh salads, and Christian's insistence on a perfectly roasted chicken. As they ate, the conversation turned to their journey, how far they had come, and what lay ahead. Simon recounted their first meeting at the diner, earning a laugh from Nancy when he mimicked Christian's astonishment at his bravery. "I can't believe you chased down that thief," Nancy said, shaking her head. "Had to," Simon replied, his grin mischievous. "Who else was going to save this guy?" Christian chuckled, raising his glass. "To Simon and to Nancy, the bravest people I know." They clinked glasses. the sound ringing softly in the cozy room. Nancy's gaze lingered on Simon and Christian, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. For the first time in years, she felt whole. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Simon insisted on teaching Nancy how to fold the perfect paper plane. Christian watched as they laughed and teased each other, his heart full. Nancy held up her finished plan, her smile radiant. "You think this one will make it to the moon?" Simon nodded seriously. "Definitely. You've got the co-pilot's approval." As the evening wound down, they sat together on the couch, the warmth of their shared journey enveloping them. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it no longer defined them. Together, they had built something new, something stronger. Christian looked at Nancy and Simon, his voice quiet but firm. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Nancy leaned against him, her voice soft. "Together." Simon grinned. "Always." The family sat in comfortable silence, the glow of the fireplace casting shadows that danced along the walls. The journey had reached its zenith, and although the future remained unwritten, it was brimming with promise. Built on the unshakable foundation of love, resilience, and hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.